It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson. I'm the founder of happyfamilies.com.au and the author of 6 books about how to make your family happier. Really excited to have a return visitor to the podcast today, Rachel Tomlinson, psychologist from WA and the author of a wonderful book called Teaching Kids to Be Kind. We chatted with her just a handful of weeks ago. We were talking about how we can help our kids to be kind to themselves, to us as parents and to their siblings. Today, a different kind of conversation. Rachel has just recently, just in the last few weeks, released a book called A Blue Kind of Day. It's a kid's book about depression and feeling sad. And Rachel joins me today. Really nice to be with you again, Rachel. Thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
So
Great to be here.
Tell me a bit about A Blue Kind of Day. What's the book really about, and why did you decide that we needed to have a book about depression for kids?
I'll start with that question first. It goes all the way back to when I was working in play therapy and I had parents asking me for resources for their kids. And the publishing landscape has changed since then. There are definitely more things out there now. But back when I was working with parents and families, there really wasn't a huge amount of resources. They wanted to be able to, read to their kids or share stories. There's a few stories out there about like grief and loss, and they're sort of a bit more popular in, in the publishing space. And I just couldn't find anything that was really connected. And I really felt for these children because they couldn't see themselves and their lived experience reflected in literature. They would see these happy-go-lucky stories of kids that are having, very small kind of problems, and not to undermine that, that a small problem is any less, but they couldn't see themselves. And so what I ended up doing was, as part of the therapy, we would write up a little story about a character who was very similar, who lived or had similar lived experiences, and we built coping that they'd been learning in play therapy into this book. And it wasn't a resolution like, hey, everything's fixed, everything's great, but it was a story that they could see themselves in, and they would illustrate it and they would take it home and their parents would read it to them. And I had a colleague who was like, you should publish a book. And this is actually a book that I wrote way before I even did Teaching Kids to Be Kind. It's just taken a long time to make its way out into the world. And so the story is a very gentle, quiet story about a young boy experiencing depression and sadness. Those words are never used in the book. It's very much based on how children have described depression to me in their bodies. So kids talk about what depression feels like. They don't say, hey, mum or dad, I'm depressed. They don't really do that. And so there's a lot of metaphor and use of language or descriptions of sensations in the body so that children can connect to that and can understand it and make sense of it. And it's also a very gentle story about not rushing feelings, about, families wanting to fix it and make it better, but sometimes it's just the space where they can hold their young person and allow them to have those sad feelings and support them by being present and being connected. And so the story doesn't end with, hooray, his depression is gone. It kind of ends on a message of, hope. And then at the very end of the book, it's got some tips for what parents can look out for, what kind of behaviours and things they might notice, and also a couple of strategies around sort of emotional intelligence, giving them the words to describe their feelings.
So interesting listening to you talk about that, Rachel, because when I think of the way we are with our children and their emotions, so if I'm running a workshop for parents, I'll say to them, what emotions in your children are okay? Actually, let's change that. And I do it intentionally. I ask the question and I go, oh, hang on a sec. What emotions are not okay? What emotions are not okay? And usually some parents will put up their hand and say, well, I don't think anger, and as they're even answering, I can hear that hesitation. I don't know about anger. Oh, maybe anger is okay. I don't know about, oh yeah, it's okay. And eventually every parent in the room will say, our children's emotions are okay. Every emotion is okay. Every emotion is part of that whole and lived human experience. Mm-hmm. And then my next question is, so what do we do when our children are having emotions that we feel discomfort around? whether it's depression or whether it's anger, or even when they're stupidly happy and they're bouncing off the walls and off the beds and off the mattress. And what do we do as parents? We try to stop the emotion because we find it inconvenient or we find it uncomfortable. And I love the way you've described in the book. We've got little Cohen, who's having a really, if I can paraphrase another book that's one of my favourites around this idea, who's having a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. And probably having a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad week or month or life. And instead of saying, as a parent, my job is to fix this and fix you and make you better, what you're saying is these parents have gently stepped into the scene and said, wow, this is tough. We're going to be here with you while you feel this, so you feel supported even when things aren't right. That's my sense of what you're saying.
100%. They try it at first, they pull out a favorite teddy, they tell a joke, they go, come on, you get up, you'll be fine. The worst thing you can tell someone with depression is just get over it, or just cheer up. If that truly worked, I'd be out of a job. It doesn't work that way. It is about, patience and time. Like emotions come and they go, and we don't always have control over them. Sometimes they come for a long time and they stick around. Sometimes it's like short and sharp and over and very intense, and then they're done. But what the story really wants to sort of, what I really want to get at in the story is about, patience and waiting and being okay to not be okay.
Beautiful. Right after the break, we're going to talk about the way that depression does show up in kids, the words that they use, and also how old they are when we start to see signs of depression and other mental illness in our little ones. Tweens, Teens and Screens is the webinar you need if you're struggling with screen time at home. Join me as I unpack the simplest methods to deal with the screen scene and eliminate the drama without having to ban all devices, even in some of the trickiest situations. Screens can work in your family's favour even if you have tweens and teens. Check out Tweens, Teens and Screens at happyfamilies.com.au. It's the Happy Families Podcast, the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now. This is Dr. Justin Coulson. Today, I'm having a chat with Rachel Tomlinson, the author of a book for kids called A Blue Kind of Day. It's a picture book to help kids who are having a rough time with their big and challenging let's call them negative emotions. I'm a bit uncomfortable with the use of the word negative because sometimes those negative emotions are pretty darn helpful and positive. But in this case, we're talking about this challenge. Rachel Tomlinson is the author. She's a WA psychologist, and we've got to understand a bit more about depression in kids, Rachel. I mean, historically, most of the research that was current when I was going through my university experience suggested that diagnosis of depression in kids would be pretty unusual. We don't really start to diagnose depression in kids until they're well into their tween years and often their teen years. Much more likely to see anxiety with kids, although the two are related. What are you seeing nowadays? What's the research saying about when depression can show up at its earliest and when it shows up on average?
I still don't think that we're necessarily any closer to pinpointing an age, because it's all about being able to describe internal experiences, and our children are notoriously not so great at that. And all of the, testing materials or sort of questionnaires that you might run with someone to try and determine, or do they have these symptoms of depression? Children, first of all, they haven't really done a lot of research into using those with younger age groups.
Right.
And so they're not as reliable. So things like the depression, anxiety, stress scale isn't really typically used for children under 12. So it comes down to children not being able to sort of express that internal stuff to be able to pinpoint that they are describing or that they are experiencing symptoms of depression. It can be very complicated. It's not to say that they're not experiencing it, which is why we need to sort of look at some of the behaviours that maybe the child would talk about and how they would make sense of those experiences. So children often describe like a heaviness in their body. So what they're referring to is psychomotor retardation, which sounds like a big fancy word, but it's like the slowing down of the body. And so they might have trouble getting out of bed. They might sleep too much, or they might have sleep disturbance, hard to get to sleep or stay asleep, feeling exhausted and sort of having to drag themselves through the day.
Kind of sounds like every parent I know, Rachel.
Or parents of teenagers, they might notice that. Right. That's one thing. A full diagnosis of depression is a combination of many different symptoms, and it's not just they experienced it for one day out of the week. Everybody is going to experience some symptoms across their lifetime. But what it's talking about is that those experiences continue for most of the day, and that occurs most days of the week. And then again, that it's occurred for an extended period of time. So not just that sporadic kind of here and there. And that's when we sort of start to put together a bit of a picture that maybe this is something that we need to look a bit more into. And it can be even things like for children, you've got a primary and a secondary emotion. So they've got the emotion underneath, but it appears in different ways. Particularly when I was working with boys, feelings of sadness were often expressed as feelings of agitation or anger because they felt very uncomfortable being sad. It was a very vulnerable feeling for them, which is why the character in this book is a male, because they find it a little bit harder. Well, the clients I've worked with have found it a little bit harder to connect to that feeling of sadness. So describing sort of like feeling like tight and body coiled up, feeling, uncomfortable and confused, finding it hard to put their thoughts together and express their thoughts. There are many different ways that a child would describe depression than what we would as adults be able to articulate.
So, Rachel, as we move towards a completion of this conversation about your book, if parents are worried that the kids may be depressed, what would the central message be from you to help them to identify the next best thing that they can do to support their child?
I think it's very important to open up the conversation. First of all, we want to hear from our kids how they're feeling, what they're feeling, not rushing them through the feeling. So if you're asking the question, allowing them to speak it, to say it out loud, reflecting back what you hear to help your child make sense of that internal world. Give them words for emotions so that it's a bit like a cat. Cats and dogs, when you break it down, are very, very similar. And our children only learn that a cat is a cat because we say it a million times when they point at the cat and say dog, and we correct them and say, oh no, that's not a dog, that's a cat. Eventually they learn it over time. We have to give our children the words for their feelings as well so that they can describe them and we can help them make sense of that. But it's also about, if they are feeling low and flat, trying to find ways that they can cope with that. So things like sensory regulation, finding some ways to self-soothe or look after themselves via their senses. So different like smells, different things to like touch and squish, like Play-Doh, or, songs that make them feel happy. Giving them a sense of control over their emotions by giving them some strategies to cope is a really great place to start. But as I always say, you as a parent are the expert of yourself and of your children, but you're not necessarily a professional. So being really aware of where your capacity, like where your limits are, where you feel comfortable supporting your child, and at what point you might then need to reach out and get some professional support as well.
Great advice. Rachel Tomlinson, the author of A Blue Kind of Day, a new children's book about feeling sad or even depressed. We will link to the book in the show notes. Thanks for joining us in the conversation today, Rachel. Really valuable stuff.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful.
The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media, and we appreciate our executive producer, Craig Bruce, for his great work on the podcast as well. If you'd like more info about making your family happier, please visit us at happyfamilies.com.au.